two patterns on my pattern preview window, a meander 1, and on this one, if you'll look, the start and end is at the top, and this is meander 1, the start and end is at the bottom. As most of you know, I do all my quilting in repeat patterns. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to change the size of this pattern. I'm going to change the pattern height, and I'm going to do this in this pattern details window. And once I change it there in this project, I will not have to change it again if I do a different quilt group or whatever. Change it to 7.5. Freeze aspect is on. Let Creative Studio adjust the width. Now I'm going to do the same thing with the other meander 1 pattern, the one that starts and ends at the bottom. Change the height to 7.5, and again let Creative Studio adjust the width. I'm going to select this first, the top meander 1 pattern with the start and end at the top. Notice I'm going to go to repeat patterns, and I never use the edge to edge mode. I'm going to place the machine in the upper left corner. Okay, if you'll notice, my reference point is upper left corner. I've changed that in the configuration form to default to upper left corner because that's what I use most of the time. Here's my repeat pattern setup, repeat pattern setting. Now, when I do an edge to edge and repeat patterns, in this total width block, I put in the total width of the quilt. In the total height block, I put in the total length of the quilt. If this pattern needs any vertical spacing, I enter it at this time. This particular pattern, I do not need vertical spacing. Now I'm going to show you how simple this sets up. Let's say this quilt is 86 inches wide. And the length of the quilt is 94. Enter those numbers. Now you notice when I entered the 86, it said I needed 13 repeats. When I enter the 94, it comes up here, it tells me I need 13 rows. So I have everything set. All I need to do now is click OK, and it's going to set this pattern on the CAD screen, and it is going to be ready to quilt. Now one thing I would do, I would move my machine down to the right edge of the quilt, and I would check this edge to make sure this was on the edge of the quilt the way I want it to stop quilting. How far out on the edge I want this to quilt. I normally do not use boundaries for setting this up. When I quilt and roll, every time I roll and do a relocate, again I take the machine to the right side of the quilt and I check the quilt, the pattern along the edge of the quilt. I just place the machine along the edge of the quilt and I use the crosshair to make sure that it's where I want it to be. Now I used all of this 86 and 94 just to show you how quickly I have set up an edge-to-edge project in repeat patterns. It's ready to quilt. There's no doubt about it. Now I'm going to start a new quilt group. In fact, I want to name this rename this quilt group. I can rename the quilt group. I'm going to simply call it RP Setup 1. Notice it's changed the name of the quilt group, the RP Setup 1. Now I'm going to start a new quilt group. Again, I'm just going to call this RP e2e Demo 1. Now I don't want to quilt all of this just for demonstration purposes of this video. Again, I have my pattern selected. I'm in a new quilt group. Click Edge to Edge. It will give me my edge to edge setup. Here I'm simply going to put in two repeats and 3 rows. Notice that I put in 2 repeats, 3 rows. It says it's going to be total width is 22.92 inches, total height is 22.5. I only did this to show for this video so that it won't take very long to quilt this out. I click OK. It's going to put 2 repeats and 3 rows on the screen. Notice that you can see here we have 2 repeats, the one here and one there. Then we have 3 rows. There's a start point, and a start point. Now I'm going to actually quilt a row of this and I'm going to show you how to do a relocate. Remember, I'm all ready to quilt. And if this was just a small panel or something, I would take my machine and I would move it to the right edge of the quilt, and I would check the alignment of that pattern along the right edge of the quilt. If I needed to make an adjustment, I would select all. Use this select all, and I would use the arrows to move my quilt pattern out to the edge where I want it to stop. I don't want this to quilt off the edge, but then I don't want it to stop before it gets to the edge. Now that I've made my adjustment, I'm all set. At this time I might go ahead and just save my project, and it gives me a chance to name it. I'll just call this RP e2e Demo, and then I'll click Save or just hit Enter. Now I have it saved. I'm going to quilt. Notice when I hit the quilt icon, the machine is going to move right to the start point of that pattern. Now, I know you can't see it because it removed the crosshair. So I'm going to just hit stop. Now you can see the crosshair. So when I hit stop, the crosshair returns, and the crosshair shows that the needle is right at the start point of this pattern. And again, if I hit quilt, it's going to take a stitch. And then I'll hit start or OK. And it's doing a tie off. You can see that, as indicated by the red line, that here that it's showing that the machine is going through, following the pattern to do the stitching. Okay, we're getting close to the end of these two repeats, and it's going to do a tie off. And I'll cut the bobbin thread. Okay, it's completed those two repeats. I've cut the bobbin thread. Now I'm going to click OK and let the machine move to the start point of the next row. Now I could quilt two rows, but for demonstration purposes, I'm going to just simply click OK, let the machine go to the start point of the next row. I'm going to let it take a stitch. Then I'm going to click stop. Now you notice that I have the crosshair back. And I let it take that stitch. I hit stop. I move the machine out of the way, and I'm going to mark that point where the machine took a stitch at the start point of the next row. Right there is where it took the stitch. You can see the crosshair shows it is at the start point of the next row. And I let it take the stitch. I hit stop. I moved the machine. Pulled up the bobbin thread. Now I'm going to reach underneath and I'm going to cut the bobbin thread. I've also placed a pin at this point where the machine made the stitch, a straight pin. Then I take the thread and I wrap it around that pin so that the thread does not get pulled out of the quilt. This is going to be my start point of the next row. It's going to be the point that I'm going to use to relocate the project origin after I have rolled the quilt. Okay, I have rolled the quilt. Now look where the crosshair says the needle is. The needle is way up here. Now that point, the start point of that row, that's rolled up on the take-up roller. So I need to do something so I can tell the machine that I want it to start stitching right at this point. Right now the needle is actually located at this point where the machine took the stitch, and I marked that point. So how do I get the machine to know where that point is? Right click on this first repeat in this next row to quilt. Go down to relocate, select relocate project origin. I could relocate all to one point, but I usually use relocate project origin. I click on that and it says, gives me the notice form. This will realign all patterns in the project, move the machine head to the new start point of the selected pattern, click yes to proceed, no to cancel. So I'm going to click yes. Notice it took Creative Studio a little bit to work through this. Creative Studio is telling me now that I've relocated this project. My needle is at the start point of the next row where the machine took the stitch at the end of that last row. Again, I'll check my edge of the quilt to make sure that my pattern is going to be lined up where I want it to be, and if I need to, I'll make an adjustment to the pattern. Put the machine head where the needle is right on the edge of the quilt, the right edge of the quilt, and check your pattern for alignment. That looks good. All I need to do now is click the quilt icon, and it's going to go to the start point of that next row. Okay, I've clicked quilt. It went to the start point where it's supposed to, and it took a stitch. I pulled up the bobbin thread, and if I want to quilt this row, I would go ahead and hit OK, and it would start quilting and quilt this next row of patterns. I'm going to stop this and show you how I adjust the pattern to fit the length of the quilt. Now, what we're going to do now, and right here you can notice that this shows, the crosshair shows that that needle is at the start point of that next row. When I get close to the end of a quilt, what I do is I select all of the rows, maybe 3 rows, 2 rows, even 4 rows, depending on the pattern, depending on how long the quilt is. I'll just draw this marquee box around the patterns that are left. Now, notice Creative Studio tells me that I have 15 inches of pattern. Well, let's suppose I measure the quilt, actually measure the quilt top, and I have the needle sitting right along the top edge of the next row to quilt, just like it is now. And I measure from where the needle is to the end of the quilt. I have 2 rows here to make this adjustment if needed. Maybe I only have 14 1/4 inches or 14 3/4 inches of quilt. So this is the time to make that adjustment. So I would zoom in where I can see. I would select this bottom wedge, and I would move the pattern up, and to see, and then when you let go, it'll tell you how much. So that's 14.71, but I only have 14 3/4, so I'll bring it up a little bit more. 14.74. There I have it adjusted to 14.75. Now, that's how I would adjust the pattern over several rows so that the adjustment will never be noticeable. Maybe instead of 15, I had 15 1/2 inches of quilt left. again, I can do the same thing. I can grab this bottom wedge and pull the pattern down, and now I'm making this over 2 rows, and preferably I would make it over 3 or 4 rows. Getting close to what I want. Notice if you zoom in, it's easier to make the adjustment. Now I have it at 15.5 inches, and I would just click off the pattern to get out of that. So that's how you make the bottom edge adjustment of the quilt. Now this only covers a pattern that has the start point at the top.